I should have known the exact weight of the envelope before I opened it, the kind of muscle memory you build after years of applying for scholarships and holding your breath while loading portals buffer your future inch by inch. But the Columbia letter felt different even in my hands, dense and official, the university crest raised on creamy paper that smelled faintly of ink and confidence. When I read, "We are pleased to inform you," I didn't scream. I folded slowly onto the cheap bar stool by the kitchen counter, as if the whole house might tilt and set me down gently. I'd made spreadsheets for this moment, built color-coded timelines, counted hours at the tutoring center, at the bookstore register, at the rehab clinic where I filed patient charts until midnight. I had been rehearsing one sentence for years. I'm going to grad school, and finally it fit in my mouth like something earned rather than borrowed. The account was supposed to be quiet backbone, not a question mark, the Andrews Education Fund, which sounded grander than it was. It began with a christening gift from my grandmother, a few $100s my parents swore would grow into something meaningful. Birthdays added drips. Babysitting money I insisted they deposit when I was 14. Tax returns Dad promised to transfer at the end of every April. I checked the balance twice a year because vigilance calmed me. It didn't matter that I already had need-based aid lined up and a small departmental scholarship. That account was a promise my family made to the version of me who kept showing up. 3 weeks after the acceptance, I logged into the credit union app during a lull at work, meaning only to verify the routing number I'd give Columbia's financial office. The number that mattered, though, sat on the top line, $0. I blinked, refreshed, logged out, in, as if repetition could repair arithmetic. The ledger below had a tidy sequence of transfers, 4 of them, leaving the account in neat parcels, like a polite robbery. The memo fields made my stomach pitch. Catering *, venue hold *, photographer * custom decor. For a second, there was nothing but the hush that comes before a scream. Not shocked so much as the failure of language, my brain reaching for the grammar of reality and finding all the verbs gone. I made it through my shift by moving mechanically, stack, scan, bag, smile. The whole time the app burned in my pocket, an accusation I couldn't silence. On the bus home, the city felt overly articulate, the particular tin clatter of a coin dropped by a kid in the back, the slick kiss of tires through a puddle, the sticky snap of someone unpeeling a label from a bottle, everything saying real, real, real while the number 0 pulsed behind my eyelids. Dinner had the choreography of any pre-wedding evening in our house, a little too bright, a little brittle around the edges. Lily had draped swatches of blush and sand-colored fabric over a chair like captured flags. Mom had set the table with the good plates, though it was just meatloaf and salad. Dad took his chair at the head, the way he had when I was 5 and when I was 17 and now 27, tapping his folded napkin against the table as if he were keeping time for a family that needed conducting. The smell of balsamic and garlic rose, comforting and wrong at the same time. How dare the food smell the way it always had? I had rehearsed a measured question on the ride home, something like, "Hey, do we change banks?" I didn't say it because Dad started talking about the florist and Lily made a soft noise that might have been worry, and Mom's smile had too much porcelain in it. The conversation parted around me until finally Dad turned, as if remembering I existed, and patted my hand. "Claire, your sister's wedding is next month," he said, a line delivered as though he had practiced it on the drive from work. "We needed extra funds. Don't worry, honey, you can take a loan." There was the tiniest clink as my fork touched my plate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. But something inside me tore cleanly, like the sound a page makes when you pull it out of a spiral notebook and the holes line up neat and unforgivable. "You use the college fund," I said. The words felt like stepping stones over water. Solid for half a second and then slippery with disbelief. "It's a family fund," Dad corrected mild, as if I'd gotten the pronunciation of a neighbor's last name wrong. "We started it for your education, yes, but circumstances change. Lily's budget got tight. Your mom and I, well, we didn't want her starting married life with debt. That's not how we do things." "How we do things?" The phrase stretched across the table like a velvet rope. I looked at Lily. She sat smaller than usual, her shoulders drawn up, the pads of her fingers worrying a seam in the swatch. "I told them we could cut the ice sculpture and the second photographer," she said, voice soft enough that it barely made air. Her eyes flicked to Dad, then down again. "Dad said it's tradition. He wants it to be special." My mom's hands were clasped around her water glass, wedding ring pressing a dent into her finger. Claire, she began, voice careful, we know how much school means to you. Your father thinks. She tried again. You're so resourceful. You always find a way. There it was, the story of me, as told by the people who benefited from it. I was the responsible one, the saver, the fixed point. If I could do more, I should do more. If I could withstand pressure, apply pressure. If I could survive scarcity, enforce scarcity. All love in our house, routed through usefulness. Why didn't you ask me? I said finally. It came out flat. Not a plea, not a knife, just a measure. Dad frowned, genuine confusion shading his features. We didn't want to burden you with the logistics. This is a good thing, Claire. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Grad school, you can always go later. Loans exist for a reason. And you'll make that back in a few years' time with your degree. He smiled, the salesman grin he used to talk neighbors into buying fundraiser coupon books. You're investing in family. We're investing in you. By taking my money, I said. By reallocating, he corrected gently, for the family good. Lily made a sound that might have been my name. I couldn't look at her because I didn't have a place to put her guilt yet. Mom was staring at her glass as if there were a map inside it. I have always wanted reasons. It's how I survive other people's choices, understand the story they tell themselves so I don't think I'm crazy. So I asked, very quietly, why an ice sculpture? Why the second photographer? Why now? Dad's jaw ticked almost imperceptibly. Because my colleagues will be there. Because your grandfather cared about doing things properly. Because I don't want people thinking I can't take care of my own family. Because Lily deserves to feel like a princess for one day. With each because, a piece of him came into focus. The man standing in a suit at a reception, laughing a little too loudly near the open bar, the heavy comfort of approval warming his shoulders. The show of generosity that gives a man an identity he can live inside. So I pay for Dad's reputation, I said, and even I could hear the acid crisping the edge of my voice. It startled me, that heat. I could feel it burning through years of dutiful daughterhood like bleach working a stain. Don't be dramatic, Mom whispered, as if the volume of my words were the problem and not their content. We'll figure it out. You always find a way. I pushed my chair back slowly so it wouldn't scrape. The house had never felt smaller. It was the same square footage as always, but every surface had narrowed, the corners drawn tight like a too small dress. My chest had that pre-cry ache that warns of a flood if you move too fast. In my room, the Columbia packet lay under my desk lamp, its navy cover luminous. I ran a finger over the crest, felt the indifference of ink and paper, how institutions keep breathing whether you can or not. I thought of the first time Dad took me to the credit union, how he put a hand on my shoulder and told the teller, "This one's got plans." I thought of the year I turned 16 and started tracking the fund balance in a spiral notebook, drawing a tiny star next to each deposit. I thought of the last Christmas when Dad gave Lily a necklace and me a file folder with printouts of 529 tax benefits, and how I had thanked him because the gesture was a shape that looked like love. My phone buzzed. A group text from Lily with a photo of her shoes, satin and pearl-studded. Thoughts. A beat later, another text, this one privately to me. I didn't know Dad would actually take it all. I'm sorry. The apology blinked at me like a hazard light, doing nothing to move the wreck. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms together until they hurt, the way you press two halves of a broken thing in case they remember how to seal. I tried to list out paths, defer a semester, take full loans, pick a cheaper program, quit my job to find another that pays more, move into a studio with questionable plumbing and save on rent, ask for help I knew would be called a loan and then a lesson, and then a story about how we raised you right. Each option felt like stepping around the theft instead of naming it. Down the hall, a cupboard door shut, the floorboards murmured, the dishwasher exhaled. Ordinary sounds continued their steady labor, unbothered by the new physics of our house. It occurred to me then, quietly, coldly, that I had misread the contract all along. Love, in this family, had footnotes. The fund had never been sacred, just available. My future had been an asset to be leveraged against someone else's moment. I thought of Dad's hand on mine at dinner, the practiced warmth of his voice, and understood that his promise had not been a vow so much as a story he liked telling because it made him feel like a good father. Stories are easy to spend when you believe you own the ending. I didn't cry, not then. I opened my laptop and set the acceptance letter on one side of the keyboard and the spiral notebook of old balances on the other, like bookends around a life I'd curated carefully. In the middle of them, I placed a plain sheet of paper. I wrote my name at the top. Then I wrote a word I had never used about my father before, tasting each letter as it appeared. Betrayal. The air felt clearer with it named. My hands still shook. The page didn't. The page waited, blank and patient and honest, for what I would write next. I learned quickly that humiliation is not a single blow but a climate, something you breathe without noticing until you're coughing. The house changed temperature. The hallways felt 2 degrees colder, the air thinner, as if the vents had been rerouted to favor rooms where I was not. The calendar squares filling up with Lily's fittings and tastings used to make me happy for her. Now they looked like escalation, like tally marks scratched into a wall by someone counting the days of her own dispossession. I kept hearing my father's sentence in loops, a slogan stamped on every surface: family comes first. It sounded noble until I set my life beside it and realized the word family had been trimmed to fit the people whose desires were loudest. I tried to speak with Dad the way you speak with a neighbor about a fence line, carefully marking out facts. You always said this was my money, I reminded him, keeping my voice level. I brought the ledger printouts like proof that reality had not misbehaved. He barely glanced at them. Claire, family comes first, he said, each word carefully ironed. You'll have more chances in life. Lily only gets married once. He folded his arms as if closing a file. I thought of all the times I had not had more chances, the bus that didn't come, the overtime that turned into an unpaid favor, the scholarship I lost by half a point because work shifts spilled into study hours. I thought of chances as things I had carved with my hands, not gifts that rained down on the deserving. What he offered me now was the opposite of a chance, the permission to wait while other people spent my momentum for me. So I stopped eating dinner with them. It wasn't a protest so much as self-preservation. Food tasted like apologizing. I timed my arrival home for the minute after plates were scraped and the dishwasher door sighed shut. In the night, I could smell the faint ghost of garlic and butter, which once meant comfort but now read like a memo I hadn't been allowed to annotate. I ate yogurt over the sink, not because I lacked a plate, but because standing felt like a small refusal to settle. Lily's wedding dress lived in the guest room, a pale monument. Sometimes I found her in there, half-sipped, craning her neck to see the back in the mirror. Her face was complicated, embarrassment layered neatly over excitement. Is it too much? She would ask, fingertips grazing the beadwork. Dad says every girl deserves. She stopped before deserves what, as if the sentence had become a trap even for her. I didn't hate her. The ache was uglier, knowing she stood inside a story where I had been written as the supporting character who gives up something essential so the bride can be perfect. Her guilt looked small beside the architecture of expectation built around her. Mom floated between us a little like a nurse in a ward where 2 patients' charts contradict. She offered me tea I didn't want and folded my laundry in its basket without asking, her silence practiced, loyal to harmony as a creed. Once she sat on my bed and said, without meeting my eyes, "You know your father. He can be single-minded. He thinks in terms of obligations and appearances. He was raised that way." I understood what she meant, that his behavior came with a lineage, a chain of men holding the same rules like a baton. Understanding the relay did not change the bruise the baton left. At work, I moved like a person in a museum full of objects you can't afford. I shelved new arrivals, the spines crisp beneath my fingertips. A book on attachment theory landed on my cart, then one on moral injury. I took my break behind the stacks and read about trust broken by those entrusted to protect it, about how the body registers betrayal as danger even when no one is shouting. The fluorescent lights hummed. A toddler dragged a stuffed rabbit by one ear down the aisle and looked at me like I might know where to shelve creatures who are love-thin. That evening I met Ethan at our usual coffee shop, a narrow room carved out between 2 storefronts, the barista scrawling jokes on the chalkboard in handwriting that made every eye look like a wishbone. Ethan has a voice made for telling hard truths gently. When I recounted Dad's words, he listened like a person taking dictation from a storm, alert, patient, ready to offer shelter. "You can sue him, you know," he said softly when I ran out of air. Sue my own father? The phrase felt like a fist closed around an organ. I had always believed conflict inside a family should be digested privately, even when it tasted like tin. He broke a legal agreement. Ethan said, slower now, as though explaining a rule across a wound. The account is in your name. He had no right. Legal right. The words glinted like tools I didn't know I'd been allowed to own. And yet the idea seemed monstrous, gargoyled by every story we tell about good daughters. On my way home, I imagined what my aunt would say, what the neighbors would say, what Dad's colleagues would murmur over cake. Not about the theft, but about my audacity to label it. In the taxonomy of our world, a daughter who accepts injury is called understanding. A daughter who names it is called ungrateful. Days collected like receipts. I noticed how people at church asked Lily about centerpieces and didn't ask me anything at all. I noticed how Dad's laugh was 2 notches louder when he told a story about negotiating with the caterer. He tried to charge for the tasting, but I told him I know how these things work, and how his eyes slid past me as if my presence interfered with the clean line of his narrative. I noticed how my shoulders rounded in photos now, as if protecting my heart from pixels. At the credit union, I asked for a printed history of the account. The teller, a woman with a saint's patience and a nose ring that glinted when she turned her head, printed the pages and slid them to me with a sympathetic lift of her eyebrows. "It's in your name," she said, not unkindly, as if that sentence might be a rope lowered into a well. "If you want to put alerts on it, you can." Alerts for what? For the past? I put the pages in a folder the color of old bruises and carried them home like a transcript of a language I was only beginning to read. The nights were longest. I lay awake drafting letters in my head to different versions of my father. In one, I listed the scholarships I'd brought home like trophies and asked him to name any he had sacrificed for. In another, I reminded him of 8th grade when he told me I was the sensible one, how I'd held that compliment like a candle and kept walking. In a third, I asked simply, if family comes first, why does it feel like I am not in the family anymore? None of the letters left my body. They hovered somewhere above my pillow, illuminating nothing. Shame arrived not as thunder but as fog. It threaded every conversation. I grew expert at changing the subject when friends asked about Columbia. I rehearsed deflections, paperwork delays, funding adjustments, wait lists. I hated myself for protecting the people who had injured me, but I hated the alternative too, becoming the girl whose family drama turned every room into a courtroom. Anger and loyalty fought endless rounds in my chest, equally matched and equally exhausted. Meanwhile, the wedding machine gleamed. Boxes appeared at the door, embossed invitations, boxes of votives, a single fragile tiara in tissue paper like a relic. I watched my father cradle that tiara with tender concentration, the way he used to hold my science fair posters so the glue wouldn't smudge. He did not look like a villain then. He looked like a man auditioning for the part of a good father and hitting all of his marks. In quieter moments, I could almost see the story he saw, a daughter with opportunities multiplying like cells, a younger daughter with one incandescent day, a ledger that balanced if you squinted right, a reputation that deserved polishing because it had been earned through years of paying the mortgage and showing up on time. If I could see his reasoning, why did it still flame me when it touched my skin? Because love without consent is not care. Because gifts that cost you your voice are not gifts. Because calling a theft reallocation doesn't change the math. As days thickened into weeks, guilt tried to make a home of me. It told me I was cruel for even considering Ethan's suggestion. It told me I was dramatic for using the word stolen. It told me I was selfish for expecting a promise to outlast a party. But another voice, quieter, older, started scratching at the inside of my ribs. It asked whether the girl who saved babysitting money at 14 and labeled jars and said no to spring break trips had been practicing for this, for knowing that the person you become is a contract you sign with yourself. It asked whether the family slogan I'd memorized since childhood had a line at the bottom for my signature, and if it didn't, whether I was allowed to draw one. I didn't make a grand decision that day. There was no cinematic music, no oath spoken into a mirror. There was only the slow, granular movement of anger through guilt, burning a path wide enough to walk in daylight. If I didn't stand up now, I realized, then every future family first would mean Claire last, and I would spend the rest of my life nodding politely while people translated my silence as approval. The knowledge sat heavy and exact, like a key you finally admit fits a door you've been pretending not to see. I placed it on my nightstand. I did not touch it yet, but I left the lamp on. The day I filed the complaint, the courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old air conditioning, dry, recycled, bureaucratic. My hands trembled in a way that felt private and humiliating, like a stutter in my bones. The clerk slid the stamped pages back under the glass and said, "You'll receive a notice of service." The paper made an ordinary sound when it touched the counter. Nothing in its texture betrayed that I had just set fire to the script my family used for holidays. My attorney, Anika Patel, had explained the headings with steady efficiency: conversion, unjust enrichment, breach of fiduciary duty, and I repeated them silently now like a catechism. Words that meant, you took what wasn't yours, you benefited without right, you had a duty and you failed. The fountain outside flickered. It looked like celebration if you didn't know the price of it. Service arrived at my parents' door 2 days later. Dad called and left a voicemail heavy with wounded dignity. "Claire, this is a misunderstanding. Withdraw this nonsense so we can handle it like adults." Adults, I thought, who had already made a unilateral decision and renamed theft tradition. I saved the message, then turned my phone face down as if the screen could sear me. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of litigation engaged its gears. Letters with letterheads accumulated in a stack on my desk: notice of deposition, interrogatories, a request for production. Anika spread them out like maps. "We'll keep it narrow and clean," she said. "No character assassination, just facts." I nodded. She had the kind of presence that makes a room feel balanced. Calm eyes, quick mind, a way of letting silence press on the right words. Dad retained Thomas Carver, a family friend with a courtroom voice like polished walnut. At the pretrial conference, he tried a smile that suggested good sense ought to prevail if only we would all remember our manners. "This is a family misunderstanding," he said, hands steepled, the phrase warming itself against the table until it sounded almost benign. Anika didn't smile back. "My client's money was transferred out of her account without consent," she said. "We're not misunderstanding that." The mediator, a retired judge with soft hands and a fondness for the word compromise, offered platitudes about healing. My father nodded at the word as if it were a mirror. Discovery peeled away euphemism. Subpoenaed records arrived with brutal neatness. Timestamps, digital approvals, memo lines. The wedding planner invoice listed deposits with my account number stamped discreetly in the corner, as if to remind us that reality prefers receipts. An email from Dad to Mom surfaced, subject line, "Reallocating," which would have been funny if I weren't the raw material. In it he typed, "Claire will understand. She's practical. We'll help her later." The screen didn't show tone, but I could feel the shrug trapped between lines. I stared at that sentence until the pixels blurred, and when I looked up, the office clock had eaten 20 minutes I couldn't recover. My deposition took place in a windowless room with carpet patterned to hide stains, the table scoured by 1,000 legal skirmishes. The court reporter arranged her machine like a small altar. Carver's questions came sugar-dusted. "Isn't it true you are receiving scholarship aid? Isn't it true your father contributed substantially to your upbringing? Isn't it true your sister's wedding is a significant family event?" Anika objected when necessary, not to block me but to keep the record from growing barbs. I answered carefully. Yes, I had scholarships, yes. My father had paid the electric bill and bought school shoes and taught me to check the oil. Yes, a wedding matters. None of that converted a promise into a communal jar for other people's dreams. Dad's deposition came a week later. He arrived in his best blazer, a tie I recognized from Thanksgivings where he carved the turkey with theatrical precision. Under oath, his voice tried for reason. He called the fund a family investment, then a flexible resource, then, after a pause and an almost imperceptible glance at Carver, a safety net. Each phrase slid a fraction farther from the truth like furniture inching under its own weight. When Anika asked, "Did Claire consent to the transfers?" he replied, "She would have if we'd asked." Anika let the silence widen, a quiet that made the fluorescent lighting suddenly audible. "That's not consent," she said. He shifted, just once. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse corridor hummed with minor emergencies. A clerk walked past with an armful of files that leaned like a cornice about to fail. A bailiff's badge flashed when he turned. Inside Department 14, the benches were polished to a dutiful shine, the seal glowering above the bench like a reminder that certain promises outrank others. The case was assigned to Judge Alina Morales, a woman whose hair was threaded with steel and whose docket moved with the efficiency of an escalator, steady, unsentimental, making progress whether you watched or not. My parents sat together at counsel table. My father red-cheeked and inflated with a grieved certainty, my mother pale enough that her lipstick looked theatrical. The space between them felt crowded with the versions of us we used to be. The first time I looked away, I caught my own reflection in the council table glass, suit too new, posture serviceable, the careful blankness of someone conserving emotion for later use. Carver rose first, voice warm with parental righteousness. Your Honor, this is a family matter blown out of proportion. The father has always intended to support his daughter's education. The funds were, he tasted the word, reallocated temporarily to address a once-in-a-lifetime event. There was no malicious intent here. Intent, the familiar solvent, as if harm drains away when you didn't mean it to hurt. Annika stood without rustle, a still blade. Your Honor, the account is titled solely in my client's name. She placed the exhibits where the judge could see the letters march across the page. Here are the transfers. Here are the signatures. Here is the email in which Mr. Andrews states, Claire will understand. She's practical. We'll help her later. This is not a family misunderstanding. This is unauthorized conversion of funds. Judge Morales turned a page, her finger pausing on the memo field like a metronome. Catering, photographer, venue, her eyes lifted. Counsel, why were these funds not obtained through the account holder's permission? Carver tried to stitch together the familiar, family tradition, father's duty, public embarrassment if the wedding were scaled back. Tradition, duty, embarrassment, 3 saints in a church that had never recognized me as a parishioner. Morales listened, face unreadable. When she asked, did your client attempt to secure a written authorization? Carver said, there was a mutual understanding. The judge's brow gave a microscopic twitch that felt like a verdict even though it wasn't. Then it was my turn. The clerk swore me in. The words felt heavier than they sound on television. Annika's questions were spare. What is the name on the account? Mine. Did you authorize the transfers? No. What was the purpose of the account? My education, funded by contributions represented to me as dedicated. Carver cross-examined with velvet gloves. Miss Andrews, you love your sister, do you not? Yes. You do not wish to harm your parents' reputation. I do not. You have other means of financing your education, including loans? Loans are not a substitute for stolen funds. The court reporter's keys clicked steadily, an insect sewing a record out of our breath. There is a particular quiet a courtroom can keep, a vacuum that pulls truth forward like a tide when the artifice drains away. It arrived after I answered, settled over us like a held cord. The judge leaned forward. Miss Andrews, can you explain why you were suing your father? The question could have been a trap or an invitation. I felt every version of my answer queue up: policy, precedent, outrage, grief, and chose the only one that fit inside my ribcage, because he stole my future and called it love. The sentence did not echo, but the room behaved as if it had. Carver's mouth closed on the next question he had prepared. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers finding the necklace she wore to every important thing. My father stared, not at me, but at the judge, as if she might translate what I had said into a dialect he could accept. Annika laid the exhibits down in sequence so clean the table might have sliced them itself. Bank statements with timestamps, authorization screens with his initials, the planner invoice cross-referenced to the dates of the withdrawals. The email, "We'll help her later," printed large enough that the words became an object you could not misread. She spoke without adornment. This is not about wedding flowers. It is about the boundary between promise and possession, about whether an adult daughter's assets are a communal slush fund. Carver tried to pivot, to cushion the facts with context. He invoked equity, a word that in law can mean fairness but in certain mouths becomes a fog machine. He described a father who had paid for braces, a father who had sat at soccer games in rain, a father who wanted, as any good father would, to spare his younger child shame. He said temporary again, as if time were an eraser. He said family, as if the syllables alone could absolve. Judge Morales stopped him with a raised hand, not unkindly. She turned to my father. Mr. Andrews, she said, her voice level, the account is under her name. Legally, it belongs to her. No thunderclap followed, only the air-changing shape around the statement, the way a room corrects itself after a picture frame is straightened. My father's face flushed and then washed out, the color leaving as if someone had opened a valve. His lips parted on a rebuttal that did not arrive. In that small collapse, a breath, a blink. I saw the first falter, the first hairline crack in the monument of certainty he had built and lived inside. The courtroom waited, patient as gravity. The call found me in the grocery store parking lot, engine off, hands sheltering around a paper cup gone lukewarm. The afternoon had the color of foil, bright, unyielding, and the windshield held my reflection like a question I hadn't answered yet. When my phone lit with Anika Patel, my heart did something clumsy, 2 beats at once. I answered and heard the line click into her courtroom voice, that steady register I had learned to trust. "Claire," she said, and I braced, the way a body braces before a wave. "You won. The court ordered your father to return the full amount plus damages." Silence, then everything at once. The cup tipped. Coffee bled into the cardboard tray, my breath found an edge and cut itself. Relief didn't come as a shout, it came as surrender, my shoulders dropping like they had been waiting years for permission. Sorrow threaded through the same space, the grief of what had been spent to buy this clarity. Underneath both was something clean and bright I hesitated to name. Pride, unashamed and earned. I pressed the phone to my cheek as if I could absorb the verdict through skin, nodded even though she couldn't see me, and managed, "Thank you." Anika exhaled, a sound like a stitch being tied. "I'll forward the order and next steps. Take the rest of today for yourself." I didn't. I sat there and let the body react the way it wanted. Tears sudden and unprivate, a laugh that sounded to my own ears like a cough, hands shaking with adrenaline now that the threat had been named and ended by someone with authority to do so. I thought of all the phrases that had tried to make what happened reasonable: reallocation, family first, misunderstanding, and watched them drain of power, leaving only the accounting. The opinion would be typed in a neutral font, filed in a drawer, indexed by number. But for me it had texture, the weight of a line being drawn and held. By the time I went inside the store, the fluorescent lights felt gentler than usual, as if the world had dialed down its scrutiny. I moved slowly through aisles that had seen me before with lists like battlefield strategies. I bought blueberries and pasta and a celebratory pint of ice cream that would turn, later, into a small private ritual with a spoon and a chair pulled close to a window. At the register I texted Ethan. Decision came in. We won. He sent back a string of hearts and a sentence that for once didn't try to fix me. "Proud of you, not for winning but for standing." News travels fastest along the tendons of a family. Dad didn't call. He didn't text. The first evidence of his response was a sudden quiet where his voice used to be. Weeks slid past marked by bank notices and formal language. Funds received, damages credited, interest accrued. The transfers landed with clinical efficiency, numbers filling the vacuum that had been carved in the shape of my future. I'd opened the credit union app and watched the balance bloom, not with greed but with a kind of astonished recognition, like finding a pulse where you were told there was none. I printed the confirmation and slid it behind the Columbia acceptance letter, a pair of documents that looked together like proof that reality can be persuaded to behave. Lily texted 2 days later, a message that read like someone walking carefully across a glass floor. "I wish it hadn't come to this, but I understand." I wrote back that I loved her because I did, and that none of this was about wanting her to be diminished. My thumb hovered over the keyboard as I resisted the temptation to narrate the months she hadn't seen. The yogurt over the sink, the courtroom hush, the word betrayal written in my neatest hand. I deleted the draft and sent only, "I hope you're okay." She responded with a heart and nothing else. Between us, a detent, thin but real. There was no parade, no confetti. Triumph arrived as order. I walked differently in my own hallway, no longer checking if the floor would hold. I slept a little deeper, like a person who has returned the key to a thief and locked the door behind him. When I passed my parents' house on a drive across town, the lawn looked exactly as it always had, mowed with lines as straight as my father's part. Yet the house felt unfamiliar, not a homeland but a place on a map with borders clearly drawn. I didn't hate it. I accepted it, the way you accept that a childhood street shrinks when you come back as an adult. Not because the asphalt changed, but because you now measure distances honestly. I met with Anika to finalize paperwork. Her office plants looked newly watered. The corners of her mouth relaxed when she saw me. She walked me through the judgment line by line, pausing to translate where the law became its own dialect. "This is what damages mean here," she said, tapping the paragraph. "This is what it signals about consent. This is the part your father's attorney wanted to blur." I realized, hearing her, how much of this victory consisted of refusing to accept blur as a moral category. We shook hands, a gesture as old as agreements, and when I thanked her again, she said, "You made it easy to argue the truth." Money returned isn't the same as harm undone, but it is ballast. I drew up a new budget at my kitchen table, the satisfaction of columns and rows almost sensual. Tuition, rent, books, a modest laptop upgrade to replace the machine that sounded like a weary plane on takeoff, a bus pass, a line labeled leftover that I guarded as if it were a living thing. I bought 2 legal pads and a pen that glided, because small tools matter when you're rebuilding. I stood in the campus bookstore and let myself pick a sweatshirt with the crest that had first made me feel chosen. This time I wore it without the secret of deficit tugging at the hem. Grad school began not with a cinematic trumpet blast, but with syllabi and passwords and the choreography of seats on the second day when everyone stops pretending to be casual. In the lecture hall's tiered rows, I felt the old muscle of focus flex and hold. The professor drew a diagram of attachment styles on the board, chalk dust marking her sleeve, and I copied it carefully while a parallel diagram sketched itself in the back of my mind. How promises create bonds, how bonds fray when tested, how repair depends on accountability rather than apology alone. Not bitterness, comprehension. Every concept had a human echo I could hear now with 3-dimensional clarity. Late nights in the library became a new kind of sanctuary. The building exhaled the soft carbon of other people's work. Lamps pooled light on tables designed for persistence. I stacked articles into the architecture of a tower and chewed through them with an appetite I hadn't felt since the first day of freshman year, before I learned to carry 2 jobs and an expectation. Each citation I understood felt like a small reclamation, a bead clicked into place on an abacus only I could see. When exhaustion pressed against my temples, I thought of the ledger entries: catering, photographer, custom decor, and felt not rage, precision, the knowledge that I had converted those lines back into hours of reading, into paragraphs underlined twice, into a brain that refused to be mortgaged. Sometimes on the walk home past the campus gates, I rehearsed the sentence I had said in court, testing its resonance against different angles of night. He stole my future and called it love. In the new air, it no longer sounded like an accusation alone. It sounded like a definition of love that counts and love that counterfeits. I let the words live in me without poisoning the water. That was the work now. Not forgetting, not forgiving prematurely, but metabolizing the past so it could power motion rather than stall it. Dad's silence continued, not eloquent but loud. It came dressed as principle. I recognized it as pride. I did not chase it. I stopped writing imaginary letters to the man I had wanted him to be. When grief arrived, it did so honestly, in small precise pangs, hearing a joke I knew he'd like and not sending it, smelling charcoal and remembering summers with burgers and a radio balanced on the stoop, catching my face in a mirror and finding his brow there like a watermark. I did not try to scrub those parts away. The verdict had separated accounts, not erased lineage. On the night I submitted my first major paper, a carefully argued piece on moral injury and institutional betrayal, I walked home beneath a sky the color of slate rubbed with silver. In my bag, the printed pages made a physical sound when they shifted, the whisper of proof. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, turned the key, and understood that triumph had not made me bigger. It had made me exact. The boundaries that are supposed to protect a person had been tested. I had learned to hold them myself. Every late-night study session, every return dollar assigned a purpose, every chosen silence where a pleading text might once have gone. That was reclamation, brick by brick, until the place I lived in belonged to me again. The community center smelled like warm dust and citrus cleaner, a scent that always reminds me of first days, new classes, fresh notebooks, rooms where the chairs have been reset into hopeful rows. Sunlight angled through the high windows and turned particles in the air into a slow, deliberate snowfall. On the wall behind the podium, someone had taped a banner hand-lettered in thick strokes, Women's Empowerment Workshop, claiming boundaries, rewriting stories. The letters wavered slightly where the tape curled, an imperfection I loved because it announced that people, not institutions, had built this gathering with their hands. I arrived early and watched the room fill in pieces, a mother with a stroller and a quiet, capable walk, a retiree in a cobalt blazer who carried a legal pad as if it were a passport, 2 college students sharing earbuds, faces flushed with the energy of arguments that follow you out of lecture halls and into your life. On the side table, coffee in industrial urns, plates of store-bought cookies, a bowl of name tags and a marker that left the thick, generous line of a permanent choice. I printed Celery and after a breath, added she/her. Not because there was confusion, but because declaring yourself has become a ritual of consent. When it was my turn, I stepped to the small podium with its faint graffiti. Someone had dubbed the outline of a heart into the wood years ago, a declaration that survived cleanings and new coats of varnish. I told the truth cleanly, without gossip or grind. I did not inventory every injury. I set out the architecture, a promise made, an account in my name, a withdrawal without consent, the courtroom where language had to stand up straight, the judgment that returned money but not the time I lost learning how to pronounce no without apology. I said it the way I now say my own name, without rising into a question. I'm not here to teach anyone how to punish their family, I told them, feeling my voice settle into the middle register where it lives when I'm certain. I'm here to say that sometimes justice isn't about punishing someone else. It's about showing yourself that you matter too. The room made the particular silence of people listening with their whole bodies, eyes not merely pointed at you but engaged in the act of weighing. Outside, a bus hissed and moved on. In the pause, my heart beat like a metronome, reminding me that tempo is chosen, not inherited. I'd expected anger from the audience, the clean, electric kind that jumps like sparks between metal. Instead, the first questions came from the soft, dangerous province of nuance. A woman with a wedding ring and a tremor asked, "How did you tell the story to yourself without hating them?" Another younger said, "How do you make peace with being called selfish?" A third asked a practical question about banks, how to title accounts, what paperwork keeps promises from becoming communal wish lists. I answered all three from the same place, the firm ground between compassion and clarity. I explained the legal steps in language that refused to mystify. I spoke of capacity and consequence, of how love without boundaries corrodes into control. I talked about the grief you carry when you draw a line and discover who declines to step toward you. Afterward, people formed a small, respectful line. They brought fragments: a father who borrowed a daughter's severance package to gamble, a husband who signed his partner's name for a car he wanted but couldn't finance, a grandmother who kept a child's birthday money safe until every dollar was reclassified as the cost of keeping the lights on. These were not exotic betrayals, they were the daily erosions that wear a person smooth. I listened the way I wish someone had listened to me, without immediately moving to solutions, without hand-delivering platitudes that ask the wounded to forgive while they're still bleeding. She approached near the end, hair pulled back, eyes wary, a backpack strap twisted tightly in her fists like a tourniquet. "My parents took my savings to help my brother start a business," she said, and the rush in her voice told me she'd had to rehearse to keep it from breaking. I thought I had no voice. Now I think I might. She smiled then, small and stunned, as if the idea had climbed onto the table and introduced itself. I didn't reach for inspiration as if it were a commodity. I offered questions she could use as tools. What's in your name? What paper exists? What proof can you gather without permission? What would it cost you to remain quiet, and what would it cost to speak? Empowerment often begins not with declarations but with inventory. That's when I knew in my body, not just as rhetoric, that my fight hadn't been about line items in an account or even the courtroom victory whose ink had long dried. It was about refusing the shape I had been assigned, the daughter who understands, the woman who absorbs the impact, the person who becomes a resource whenever other people's dreams become urgent. It was about breaking a pattern that recited itself through generations in the pitch of paternal generosity and then collected tribute from the quiet ones. It was about declining to let love justify betrayal. Standing there, I also admitted what still stings, the family fracture whose edges don't always dull on schedule. The part of me that hears a certain song and sees a certain backyard, that tastes charcoal and remembers summers where everyone had a chore and a joke. I've learned something that steadies my hands when memory tugs. Forgiveness doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means moving forward stronger, alone and free. Forgiveness to me now is the decision to stop auditioning for redemption in the eyes of those who harmed you. It is giving back the responsibility for their remorse and keeping for yourself the job of staying intact. I told the room the rituals that rebuilt me because rituals translate across lives. I spoke about budgets as forms of truth-telling, not scarcity theater. About passwords changed and accounts retitled and signatures verified by habit rather than hope. About boundary sentences you keep in your pocket like talismans. I'm not available for that. No is a complete sentence. If you need me to betray myself to prove I love you, the test is broken. The older woman in the cobalt blazer wrote them down with the satisfaction of someone who collects instruments and knows how to tune them. Someone asked, "Do you regret suing?" I said that regret is not the right category. I regret the necessity. I do not regret the act. If the roof is on fire, you do not regret the water just because the couch gets wet. The room laughed, not because it was funny, but because truth sometimes wears humor so we can digest it. When the workshop ended, chairs scraped gently, the ordinary benediction of a room releasing people back into their errands and affections. The organizer, gray braid, sensible sandals, eyes like a clear lake, squeezed my hand and said, "You didn't preach, you named." It felt like the finest compliment available to a person who tells a hard story in public, that I had not tried to convert anyone, only to align language with reality so they could see their own path. I stayed behind to help stack chairs, the humble work that honors a gathering. Outside, the late afternoon had softened. The sun skimmed the tops of cars like a hand checking for fever. I walked to the bus stop with my tote bag heavier from pamphlets and lighter from what I'd set down. On the bench, I wrote 3 lines in my notebook, not as goals but as reminders. 1. Generosity without consent is extraction. 2. Love without boundaries is control. 3. Justice is not a thunderclap. It is a series of exact choices. The ink pulled a little on the paper, the way words do when they're freshly decided. Across the street, a teenage girl waited with a violin case, practicing fingerings on the air. She looked like every version of me who once believed that being good would be receipt enough. I wanted to tell her that goodness is not a shield, that clarity is, that the world will try to invoice you for your silence and call it harmony, that you can learn to send that bill back, stamped RETURN to said ENDDR, without apology. The bus arrived. I stepped on with everyone else, women carrying groceries and briefcases and babies, and the invisible freight of decisions. The driver nodded, an acknowledgement as ordinary and holy as any blessing. I found a seat by the window and as the city slid past, felt a quiet that wasn't emptiness but alignment. Not triumph as a trophy, not righteousness in neon. Simply the weight of my own life resting where it belonged, inside my hands, inside my name, inside a story I now knew how to author.